The eagle grabbed the grandmother's grandson, but the reason surprised everyone. When the eagle... In the heart of the majestic Rocky Mountains, where mountain peaks reach the clouds and forests whisper ancient secrets, lies the charming village of Pinewood. It's a place where tradition intertwines with everyday life, and nature seems closely connected to the lives of its inhabitants. Among the narrow, cobblestone streets and wooden houses with characteristic decorated balconies, lives a woman who has become a living legend of the village, Mrs. Emily. Mrs. Emily, despite her 70 years, emanates extraordinary energy and wisdom. Her grey hair, usually braided, shines in the sun like silver threads, and her eyes, deeply set in a face furrowed with wrinkles, sparkle with lively intelligence and warmth. She is known in Pinewood not only for her knowledge of herbs and ancient rituals, but above all for the extraordinary bond she seems to have with the surrounding nature. This morning, as the first rays of sun touched the roofs of Pinewood, Mrs. Emily left her house, holding the hand of her 3-year-old grandson, Tommy. The boy, with a mop of chestnut curls and eyes shining with excitement, was bouncing impatiently at her side. Subscribe to the channel and experience every moment with us. Grandma, will you tell me about the forest spirits today? Tommy asked as they headed towards the nearby grove. Mrs. Emily smiled tenderly. Of course, honey. The forest has many stories to tell, and we must learn to listen to them. As they entered the trees, the world around them seemed to change. Sunbeams, piercing through the dense foliage, created a magical mosaic of light and shadow on the ground. The air was filled with the scent of damp earth and resin, and in the distance they could hear the gentle murmur of a mountain stream. Mrs. Emily led Tommy along a barely visible path, stopping occasionally to show him a rare flower or a trace left by forest animals. The boy absorbed every word of his grandmother, his imagination blossoming with each new story. You see, Tommy, Mrs. Emily said, pointing to an old gnarled oak. This oak remembers the times when your great-grandfather was a little boy. It's said that in its branches lives a spirit that guards the secrets of the forest. Tommy's eyes widened. Really, Grandma? What does this spirit look like? Mrs. Emily laughed softly. Oh, no one has ever seen it, but sometimes, when the wind rustles among the leaves, you can hear its whisper. They continued their walk, delving deeper into the forest. Mrs. Emily felt that today was special. There was something in the air, some unspoken tension that made her senses sharper than usual. Suddenly, when they reached a small clearing, Mrs. Emily stopped abruptly. Tommy, surprised, looked at his grandmother questioningly. Quiet, honey, Mrs. Emily whispered, looking around. Do you hear that? Tommy frowned, trying to catch what had caught his grandmother's attention, and then he heard it, a soft but distinct melody, as if someone was humming an ancient lullaby. What is it, Grandma? Tommy whispered, involuntarily moving closer to Mrs. Emily. It's the song of the forest, honey, Mrs. Emily replied, her eyes shining mysteriously. It's rarely heard. It's a sign that the forest wants to tell us something. At that moment, as if in response to her words, a majestic eagle flew out of the bushes. The bird circled above their heads, then landed on a nearby boulder, staring intently at Mrs. Emily and Tommy. Mrs. Emily felt her heart start to beat faster. In her long life, she had never experienced anything like this. She knew they were on the verge of something extraordinary, something that could forever change not only their lives, but also the fate of all of Pinewood. Tommy, she said softly, not taking her eyes off the eagle. So I think we've just been chosen for a very important task. The boy, despite his young age, sensed the gravity of the situation. He squeezed his grandmother's hand tighter and asked, What kind of task, Grandma? Mrs. Emily smiled gently, though her eyes remained serious. I don't know yet, honey, but whatever it is, we'll face it together. Remember, in unity with nature lies the greatest strength. As they stood in the clearing, surrounded by the rustle of trees and the mysterious melody, Mrs. Emily felt that their lives had just stepped onto a new, fascinating path. She didn't yet know what challenges awaited them, But she was sure of one thing: this adventure would forever change Pinewood and its inhabitants. The eagle still sat motionless on the boulder, its penetrating eyes fixed on Mrs. Emily and little Tommy. The atmosphere in the clearing thickened with each moment, and the mysterious melody became louder, filling the air around them. Suddenly, without warning, the eagle spread its powerful wings and let out a piercing cry. At the same moment, the ground beneath their feet trembled slightly, and golden leaves began to fall from the surrounding trees, swirling around them in an extraordinary dance. Mrs. Emily instinctively pulled Tommy closer to her, but she didn't feel fear. On the contrary, she was filled with a sense of deep peace and understanding, as if suddenly all the secrets of the forest had become clear to her. "Grandma," Tommy whispered, watching the swirling leaves with wide-open eyes. "Is this magic?" Mrs. Emily smiled gently. "It's the voice of nature, honey. It speaks to us in the way it has done for thousands of years." As the last leaf fell to the ground, the eagle let out another cry and rose into the air. But instead of flying away, it began to circle above their heads, as if wanting them to follow. "Come, Tommy," Mrs. Emily said, taking her grandson's hand. "We must follow it. It will show us the way." They set off through the forest, following the majestic bird. The path they followed became increasingly bumpy and difficult, leading them deep into the wilderness, to places Mrs. Emily had never seen before, despite knowing this forest like the back of her hand. After some time, they reached a place that made even Mrs. Emily hold her breath in awe. Before them stretched a small valley, surrounded by high rocks. In its very center was a crystal-clear lake, and above it hovered a delicate blue glow. The eagle landed on the shore of the lake and looked expectantly at Mrs. Emily and Tommy. "Grandma, what is this place?" Tommy asked, his voice full of admiration and curiosity. Mrs. Emily shook her head. "I don't know, honey. I've never been here before. This must be one of the hidden sanctuaries of the forest." As they approached the shore, the water in the lake began to move, creating small waves. From its depths emerged a luminous figure, a woman with long, flowing hair and eyes shining like stars. "Welcome, guardians of the forest," the figure spoke in a voice that sounded like the murmur of a stream and the rustle of leaves at the same time. "We have long awaited your presence, Mrs. Emily, despite her rich experience with the mysteries of nature, felt her heart tremble. "Who are you?" she asked. The luminous figure smiled gently. "I am the spirit of the lake, one of the many guardians of this land. You have come here because Pinewood and the entire area are in danger." Tommy, who had been standing as if enchanted until now, suddenly spoke up. "What kind of danger?" The spirit of the lake turned her gaze to the boy, and her eyes filled with sadness. "The balance between the world of humans and nature has been disturbed. The illness that has afflicted the inhabitants of Pinewood is the result of this." Mrs. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. "Illness? What illness?" "People in the village are starting to fall ill with a mysterious ailment," the spirit explained. "Traditional medicines don't work, and doctors are helpless. If the balance is not restored, the disease may spread throughout the entire region." Mrs. Emily felt the weight of responsibility falling on her shoulders. "What can we do?" she asked. The spirit of the lake raised her hand, and above the surface of the water appeared an image of a rare flower, emanating a delicate silver light. "This is the moonlight flower. It grows only in the most hidden corners of the forest. Its nectar has the power to heal and restore balance. You must find it and use its power to heal the sick and restore harmony between the world of humans and nature." Tommy, despite his young age, straightened up and said bravely, "We'll do it. Right, Grandma." Mrs. Emily looked at her grandson with a mixture of pride and concern. She knew a dangerous mission awaited them, but she also felt that they had been chosen for a reason. "Yes, honey," she replied, squeezing Tommy's hand. "We'll do it. For Pinewood. For the forest of Björn, for balance." The spirit of the lake nodded approvingly. "Remember that the forest will be your ally. Listen to its whisper, and it will guide you to your goal. But be careful. Not everyone in the forest will be friendly to you. There are forces that desire chaos and destruction." With these words, The spirit's figure began to fade until it disappeared completely, leaving only gentle waves on the surface of the lake. Mrs. Emily and Tommy stood in silence for a moment, trying to grasp everything they had learned. Finally, Mrs. Emily sighed deeply and said, "Come, Tommy, we need to return to the village and prepare for the journey. A long and difficult road awaits us." As they left the valley, Mrs. Emily felt the weight of responsibility mixing with determination. She knew they were facing the greatest challenge of their lives, but looking at her grandson's brave face, she also felt that together they could face anything that fate would put in their way. The eagle that had brought them to this place rose into the air again, this time heading towards Pinewood. Mrs. Emily and Tommy set off after it, knowing that each step brought them closer to beginning an extraordinary mission. A mission that was to save not only their beloved village, but also restore balance to the entire region. The sun was setting when Mrs. Emily and Tommy reached the borders of Pinewood. The return journey from the mysterious valley seemed longer and more tiring than usual, and the weight of knowledge about the task awaiting them made each step a challenge. As they entered the cobblestone streets of the village, they immediately noticed that something had changed. Usually at this time, Pinewood was bustling with life, tourists returning from mountain hikes, and locals gathering in squares to exchange the latest gossip. Now, however, the streets were almost empty, and from the open windows of houses came muffled coughs and groans. "Grandma," Tommy whispered, clutching Mrs. Emily's hand tighter. "Why is it so quiet?" Mrs. Emily sighed heavily. "It's the illness the spirit of the lake spoke about, honey. We must act quickly." They headed towards the center of the village, where the mayor's house was located. Along the way, they passed worried residents who cast questioning glances at them. Mrs. Emily was known in Pinewood for her knowledge of herbs and natural remedies, so her appearance raised hope in the hearts of the sick and their families. When they reached the mayor's house, Mrs. Emily knocked energetically on the door. After a moment, the mayor's wife, Mrs. Sarah, opened it, her face bearing traces of fatigue and concern. "Mrs. Emily, it's good you've come," she said with relief. "My husband, he's fallen ill too. Maybe you can help." Mrs. Emily nodded. "I need to talk to him, Sarah. It's very important." They entered and were led to the mayor's bedroom. Mr. John, usually an energetic and full-of-life man, lay pale and weakened on the bed. When he saw Mrs. Emily, he tried to smile, but instead broke into a fit of coughing. "Emily," he managed between coughs, "it's good you're here. This illness, I've never seen anything like it." Mrs. Emily sat on the edge of the bed and placed her hand on the mayor's forehead. "John, I need to tell you something. What I'm about to say may seem unbelievable, but please, listen to me carefully." For the next 15 minutes, Mrs. Emily told about their adventure in the forest, about meeting the spirit of the lake, and about the mission they had received. With each word, the mayor's eyes grew wider, and disbelief appeared on his face. "Emily," he said finally, "I know you're a wise woman and have never told tales, but this sounds like fantasy." Mrs. Emily sighed. "I know, John. I can hardly believe it myself. But look at our village. This illness is not natural. We need the help of nature's forces to overcome it." The mayor pondered for a moment. "What exactly do you plan to do?" "We need to find the moonlight flower," Mrs. Emily replied. "It's the only way to heal the sick and restore balance, but I need your support. People need to know that we're acting in the interest of the entire village." John nodded slowly. "All right, Emily, I'll call a meeting in the main square tomorrow morning. You'll present your story to all the residents." Mrs. Emily felt relief, but she knew this was just the beginning of the challenges. "Thank you, John. Now, let me prepare an herbal infusion for you. It won't cure you completely, but it should alleviate the symptoms." When they left the mayor's house, night had already fallen. The streets of Pinewood were empty, and a heavy, unsettling mood hung in the air. Mrs. Emily and Tommy headed to their home, where they would prepare for tomorrow's meeting. "Grandma," Tommy spoke up when they reached home, "will people believe us?" Mrs. Emily knelt before her grandson and looked him straight in the eyes. "I don't know, honey, but we have to try. Sometimes the greatest challenges require us to believe in things that seem impossible. That night, when Tommy was already asleep, Mrs. Emily sat by the window, gazing at the starry sky. She felt the weight of responsibility resting on her shoulders, but she also felt strength and determination. She knew that tomorrow would be a day of trial, a day that would decide the fate of all of Pinewood. In the distance, from the depths of the forest, she heard a quiet whisper of the wind, reminiscent of the melody they had heard in the mysterious valley. It was like a promise that nature was on their side in this extraordinary mission. Mrs. Emily took a deep breath and whispered into the night, "We can do it, we must do it, for Pinewood, for the forest, for balance." With this thought, she began to prepare for tomorrow, knowing that she faced the greatest challenge of her life, convincing the entire community to believe in magic and the power of nature, on which the fate of their beloved village depended. The morning in Pinewood dawned misty and cool, as if nature itself reflected the uncertainty that hung over the village. Mrs. Emily woke up before dawn, her heart beating quickly at the thought of the challenge ahead. As she woke Tommy, she noticed that the boy also seemed more serious than usual. "Remember, honey," she said, stroking his head, "whatever happens today, we're in this together." When they left the house, they noticed that the streets of Pinewood were slowly filling with people. Everyone was heading towards the main square, where the meeting was to take place. There was a mixture of fear, curiosity, and hope in the air. When they arrived at the square, they saw that several hundred people had already gathered. Mrs. Emily noticed that many residents looked sick or weakened. Others were helping their loved ones stand. This sight only strengthened her determination. Mayor John, despite his own illness, stood on a makeshift platform. When he saw Mrs. Emily and Tommy, he nodded and began to speak. "Dear residents of Pinewood, we have gathered here today to listen to Mrs. Emily, who claims to have found an explanation and a potential solution to our problem." A murmur passed through the crowd. Mrs. Emily took a deep breath and stepped onto the platform, holding Tommy's hand. "My dear friends," she began, her voice steady and calm, "I know that what I'm about to say may seem unbelievable, but please, listen to me to the end." For the next half hour, Mrs. Emily told about their adventure in the forest, about meeting the spirit of the lake, and about the mission to find the moonlight flower. With each word, more and more disbelief appeared on the faces of the residents, and some even began to murmur with disapproval. "This is nonsense," someone shouted from the crowd. "We need real doctors, not fairy tales about magical flowers." "Yes," another voice supported. "How can we believe in such fantasies when our loved ones are suffering?" Mrs. Emily felt her heart sink, but she didn't give up. "I understand your doubts," she said calmly, "but look around you. This disease is not natural, traditional methods aren't working. Isn't it worth at least trying?" Suddenly, a young woman, Lisa, whose husband was one of the first to fall ill, stepped out from the crowd. "I believe her," she said loudly. "Mrs. Emily has always helped us with her herbs. If she says this can help, I'm willing to take the risk." This statement triggered another wave of discussion among the gathered. Some began to nod, while others still shook their heads in disbelief. At this moment, Tommy unexpectedly spoke up. His thin, childish voice cut through the noise of the crowd. "Please, everyone, I saw the spirit in the lake. He told us we need to find this flower to heal everyone. Grandma isn't lying." The sincerity and innocence in the boy's voice made even the biggest skeptics fall silent. Mrs. Emily felt pride swell in her heart. Mayor John took advantage of the moment of silence to speak again. "Friends," he said, coughing lightly, "I know this is hard to believe, but what do we have to lose? Our village is suffering, and traditional methods have failed. Maybe it's time to trust in the wisdom of nature." A murmur of agreement passed through the crowd. People began to look at each other, as if seeking confirmation of their thoughts in their neighbors' eyes. Finally, old Joseph, respected by all as the village elder, stepped out from the crowd. "I remember," he began slowly, "how my grandfather told me stories about times when people lived in harmony with the forest. Maybe Mrs. Emily is reminding us of something we've forgotten. These words seemed to tip the scales. More and more people began to express their readiness to support Mrs. Emily's mission. "Well," Mayor John finally said, "who is in favor of giving Mrs. Emily and her mission a chance? Raise your hand." Slowly, one by one, hands began to rise. Not everyone was convinced, but the majority decided to trust. Mrs. Emily felt relief and gratitude flood her heart. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "I promise I'll do everything in my power not to disappoint your trust." As the meeting came to an end, people began to disperse, discussing animatedly what they had heard. Mrs. Emily was surrounded by a group of residents who wanted to know more about her plans. "When are you leaving?" Lisa asked. "Tomorrow at dawn," Mrs. Emily replied. "The sooner we find the moonlight flower, the better for all of us." When people dispersed, Mrs. Emily and Tommy were left alone in the square. The boy looked at his grandmother with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. "Grandma," he asked, "can we really find this flower?" Mrs. Emily knelt before her grandson and took his small hands in hers. "I don't know, honey," she answered honestly, "but I know we have to try, for the good of everyone in Pinewood." Looking into Tommy's eyes, full of trust and courage, Mrs. Emily felt her determination grow. She knew a difficult journey awaited them, full of dangers and challenges. But she also knew that with the help of nature and the support of Pinewood's residents, they had a chance of success. As they returned home to prepare for tomorrow's expedition, Mrs. Emily felt the wind whispering in her ear, carrying a promise of adventure and hope. Pinewood was counting on them, and they couldn't fail. Dawn over Pinewood rose cool and misty, as if nature itself wanted to hide from the world the mysterious mission that was about to begin. Mrs. Emily and Tommy stood at the edge of the forest, surrounded by a small group of residents who had come to bid them farewell and wish them luck. Lisa, the young woman who had first expressed her support during the meeting, approached Mrs. Emily with a small bundle in her hands. "This is some food for the journey," she said, handing her the package. "And please be careful and take care of little Tommy." Mrs. Emily smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Lisa. I promise we'll do everything in our power to return with the cure." Mayor John, despite his illness, had also come to say goodbye. "Emily," he said in a weak voice, "the whole village is counting on you. But remember, your safety is the most important thing." Mrs. Emily nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Emily took Tommy's hand, and together they stepped into the dense forest. The sounds of the village were quickly replaced by the rustle of leaves and the singing of birds. The first hours of the journey passed in relative calm. Mrs. Emily led them along paths she knew from old times, but now they seemed strangely foreign to her. The forest seemed to be changing around them, showing them places she had never seen before. "Grandma," Tommy spoke up at one point, "how will we know where to look for this flower?" Mrs. Emily stopped for a moment, pondering the answer. "Remember what the spirit of the lake told us. The forest will be our guide. We must be vigilant and open to its signs." As if in response to her words, a beautiful blue butterfly flew out of nearby bushes. It circled around their heads, then flew deeper into the forest. "Look, Tommy," Mrs. Emily said with a smile. "This might be one of those signs. Let's follow it." Following the butterfly, they reached a small stream. The water in it was crystal clear and seemed to shine with a delicate silver glow. Mrs. Emily scooped some water into a flask, feeling that it might come in handy on their further journey. As they rested by the stream, Tommy suddenly froze and whispered, "Grandma, look." On the opposite bank stood a beautiful deer. It looked at them with its large, brown eyes, as if it wanted to tell them something. After a moment, it turned and began to walk along the stream. "Let's follow it," Mrs. Emily decided. "I feel it wants to lead us somewhere." They crossed the stream and set off in the deer's tracks. The road became increasingly difficult, the terrain more hilly and the vegetation denser. Mrs. Emily had to help Tommy several times when he stumbled over roots or slipped on wet stones. At one point, the deer disappeared from their sight and they found themselves on the edge of a large clearing. In the middle of it rose a huge old oak tree whose crown seemed to reach the sky. "Wow," Tommy gasped in admiration. "Grandma, isn't this the biggest tree you've ever seen?" Mrs. Emily had to admit that she had never seen such a powerful tree. As they approached closer, she noticed that the oak's bark was covered with strange symbols. On the contrary, his eyes were shining with excitement. The misty shape spoke in a voice that sounded like the whisper of wind in the treetops. "Welcome, seekers of balance. We have long awaited your arrival." Mrs. Emily, despite her rich experience with the mysteries of nature, felt a shiver run down her spine. "Who are you?" she asked. "I am the guardian of the forest," the figure replied. "I have protected these lands for millennia. How you have come seeking the moonlight flower, haven't you?" Mrs. Emily nodded. "Yes, we need it to heal our village and restore balance." The forest guardian seemed to ponder her words for a moment. "The flower you seek is powerful and rare. It grows only in a place where the boundary between worlds is thinnest. But I warn you, the path to it is full of dangers. Not everyone in the forest will be friendly to you." Tommy, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "But isn't the forest good? Why would it try to stop us?" The guardian turned his misty gaze to the boy. "A wise question, young man. The forest itself is neither good nor evil. It's simply part of a greater whole. But there are forces in it that desire chaos and destruction. They will try to hinder you." Mrs. Emily felt her determination grow. "What must we do to find the flower?" "You must pass 3 trials, the guardian replied. "And the trial of courage, the trial of wisdom, and the trial of heart. Only then will the forest deem you worthy and allow you to find the moonlight flower." Mrs. Emily looked at Tommy, seeking confirmation in his eyes. The boy nodded gravely, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. "We are ready," Mrs. Emily said, turning back to the guardian. The misty shape began to slowly fade. "Remember," it said, "true strength lies in unity with nature. Listen to the forest, and it will help you. Good luck, seekers of balance." With these words, the forest guardian disappeared, leaving Mrs. Emily and Tommy alone in the clearing. They stood for a moment in silence, trying to process everything they had learned. "What now, Grandma?" Tommy finally asked. Mrs. Emily took a deep breath and smiled at her grandson. "Now, honey, our real adventure begins. Let's go. We have 3 trials to pass and a flower to find." They set off into the depths of the forest, not knowing exactly what awaited them, but certain that together they could face any challenge. The forest rustled around them, as if whispering words of encouragement, and the sun breaking through the treetops lit their way, leading them towards an unknown but hopeful destiny. The forest around Mrs. Emily and Tommy seemed to grow denser with each step. The air became heavy with the scent of damp earth and wild vegetation. Despite this, they both felt a strange excitement. They knew they were approaching the first of the 3 trials the forest guardian had spoken of. "Grandma," Tommy spoke up as they pushed through the dense undergrowth, "what do you think the first trial will be like?" Mrs. Emily smiled at her grandson. "I don't know, honey, but remember, whatever it is, we'll face it together." Suddenly, the forest in front of them parted, revealing a narrow path leading to a dark cave. Above the entrance to the cave floated a blue, luminous inscription, "Trial of Courage." "This must be it," Mrs. Emily whispered, squeezing Tommy's hand. As they approached the entrance, a deep, rumbling voice came from the cave. "To pass the trial of courage, you must face your greatest fears. Only those who can look fear in the eye are worthy of finding the moonlight flower." Mrs. Emily took a deep breath and looked at Tommy. "Are you ready, honey?" The boy swallowed hard but nodded. "I am, Grandma." Together, they stepped into the darkness of the cave. At first, they couldn't see anything, but after a moment, their eyes adjusted to the darkness. Suddenly, as if out of nowhere, visions appeared before them. Mrs. Emily saw herself, old and helpless, unable to help others. The vision showed Pinewood engulfed in disease, and she could do nothing. She felt fear grip her heart, Tommy, on the other hand, saw himself lost in the forest all alone. In his vision, there was no grandma, no one who could help him. For long minutes, they both fought against their fears. Mrs. Emily recalled all the difficult moments in her life that she had managed to overcome. Tommy thought about the courage he had always admired in his grandmother. Finally, holding hands, they shouted together, "We are not afraid. We are stronger than our fears." At that moment, the visions disappeared, and the cave lit up with a warm, golden light. The voice spoke again. "You have passed the trial of courage. Your strength lies in unity and mutual support. Go on." They left the cave, feeling stronger than ever. The forest in front of them changed again, leading them to the next challenge. This time they reached a great stone labyrinth. Above the entrance floated the inscription, "Trial of Wisdom." "To pass the trial of wisdoms," the voice sounded, "you must find your way through the labyrinth. But beware, not everything is as it seems. Only those who can see beyond appearances will find the right path." Mrs. Emily and Tommy entered the labyrinth. They quickly realized that some walls were illusions, while others, though appearing transparent, were as hard as rock. "Grandma," Tommy said after a few unsuccessful attempts, "maybe we should close our eyes and listen to the forest. Remember what the Guardian said? The forest will help us." Mrs. Emily smiled proudly. "You're right, honey. Let's try." They closed their eyes and listened to their surroundings. After a moment, they heard a gentle whisper of wind that seemed to guide them. Step by step, following this sound, they passed through the labyrinth. When they reached the exit, the voice spoke again. "You have passed the trial of wisdom. Your strength lies in the ability to listen and trust nature. Go on." The last trial awaited them on a beautiful, flowery meadow. Above the meadow floated the inscription, "Trial of Heart." "To pass the trial of heart," the voice said, "you must prove that your intentions are pure and your heart's full of love and compassion." In the middle of the meadow stood an old, withered bush. In front of it lay a small, injured fawn. Mrs. Emily and Tommy immediately ran to the fawn. Mrs. Emily gently examined its wound. "It's not deep," she said, "but it needs a dressing." Without hesitation, she tore off a piece of her dress and bandaged the fawn's wound. Meanwhile, Tommy brought water from a stream that flowed at the edge of the meadow. When the fawn was bandaged and given water, something extraordinary happened. The withered bush in the middle of the meadow began to sprout new shoots, and after a moment, it bloomed with beautiful, silvery flowers. "It's the moonlight flower!" Mrs. Emily exclaimed. The voice spoke for the last time. "You have passed all the trials. Your courage, wisdom, and kindness have made you worthy of the moonlight flower. Take it and use its power to restore balance." Mrs. Emily gently picked one of the flowers, feeling magical energy flowing through it. Tommy watched all this with admiration and pride. "We did it, Grandma," he said, hugging her. "Yes, honey," Mrs. Emily replied, stroking his head. "But our mission isn't over yet. Now we have to return to Pinewood and heal our loved ones." They set off on the return journey, feeling that the forest was guiding them along the shortest and safest path. The moonlight flower glowed with a gentle light in Mrs. Emily's hand, carrying hope for the entire village. When they emerged from the forest at the edge of Pinewood, they saw that the residents were waiting for them with impatience. The sight of the silvery glowing flower elicited cries of joy and hope. Mrs. Emily and Tommy looked at each other with a smile. They knew that their adventure was coming to an end, but at the same time, they felt that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter in which Pinewood would learn anew to live in harmony with the surrounding nature. As Mrs. Emily and Tommy crossed the border of Pinewood, holding the glowing moonlight flower in their hands, the entire village was stirred. People poured out of their homes, some barely standing due to illness, others helping their loved ones. Everyone wanted to see with their own eyes if the rumors about the magical flower were true. Lisa, the young woman who had first expressed support for Mrs. Emily's mission, ran up to them with tears in her eyes. "You did it," she exclaimed. "Did you really find the cure?" Mrs. Emily smiled gently. "We hope so, but we need everyone's help to prepare the medicine and distribute it to the sick." Mayor John, despite his weakness, came out to the doorstep of his house. What do we need to do, Emily?" he asked in a weak but hopeful voice. "We need a large cauldron with clean water," Mrs. Emily replied, "and we need everyone to bring their favorite plant or herb from their garden. This will help strengthen the power of the moonlight flower." People immediately sprang into action. In the center of the village, a fire was lit, over which a large cauldron of water was suspended. Residents began bringing various plants, lavender flowers, mint leaves, rosemary sprigs, and even ordinary wildflowers. Mrs. Emily, with Tommy's help, began preparing the brew. She dropped the moonlight flower into the boiling water, and its glow spread throughout the cauldron. Then, one by one, she added the herbs and plants brought by the residents, whispering old spells and prayers she had learned from her grandmother as she did so. The air filled with an extraordinary aroma, and a delicate, silver-white mist hovered over the cauldron. Everyone watched with bated breath as Mrs. Emily stirred the brew with a large wooden spoon. After an hour that seemed like an eternity, Mrs. Emily finally announced, "The medicine is ready." The residents lined up, each with their own cup or bowl. Mrs. Emily and Tommy began pouring out the magical brew, making sure everyone got the right portion. The first to drink the medicine felt immediate relief. Color returned to their faces, coughing subsided, and their eyes regained their sparkle. News of the miraculous healing spread quickly through the village, bringing hope even to the most skeptical. When the last person received their portion of the medicine, Mrs. Emily felt her strength leave her. She sat down on a nearby bench, and Tommy hugged her. "We did it, Grandma," he whispered proudly. Mrs. Emily smiled, stroking her grandson's head. "Yes, honey, but this is just the beginning." And indeed, in the following days, Pinewood began to change. The disease completely subsided, but the residents didn't forget the lesson they had received. They began to treat the surrounding nature with greater respect. People started planting more plants in their gardens, taking care of the nearby forest, and even organizing regular expeditions to learn the secrets of nature. Mrs. Emily became not only a respected healer, but also a teacher, sharing her knowledge about harmony with nature. Tommy, despite his young age, became a symbol of the new generation, a generation that understood how important it is to live in harmony with nature. He could often be seen telling other children about their adventure in the forest and about the magic that hides in every leaf and every flower. One evening, a few weeks after their return, Mrs. Emily and Tommy sat on a bench in front of their house, watching the setting sun. The forest rustled gently in the distance, and the air was filled with the scent of summer flowers. "Grandma," Tommy spoke up, "do you think we'll ever see the spirit of the lake or the forest guardian again?" Mrs. Emily smiled mysteriously. "Who knows, honey? The magic of nature is all around us. You just need to know how to see it." At that moment, as if in response to his question, a majestic eagle flew over the forest. It circled over the village and disappeared among the trees. Mrs. Emily and Tommy exchanged knowing glances. They knew that while their adventure might have ended, the wonders of nature would accompany them always. And Pinewood, now more than ever, had become a place where magic and reality intertwined, creating a harmony that people would talk about for generations. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the sky, Mrs. Emily and Tommy returned home. But before they closed the door, they looked once more towards the forest. And for a moment, just for a split second, they thought they saw a flash of silver light among the trees, a reminder of their extraordinary journey, and a promise that the magic of nature would always be a part of their lives. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Mrs. Emily and Tommy has touched your hearts and reminded you of the extraordinary bond between humans and nature. We have prepared a special playlist with similarly fascinating stories, which you can find by clicking on the link on the left side. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a thumbs up under the video. Every day we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity of life and the magic of the world around us. Don't miss our upcoming materials. We're looking forward to your comments and opinions.